Good afternoon, everyone. I know we only have an hour for this webinar today, so I want to go ahead and get started, and then we may have other individuals join us over time. Just to introduce myself, my name is Dennis Lee. I'm an assistant professor at Northwestern University and part of the Implementation Science Coordination, Consultation, and Collaboration Initiative that is here. ISKI, as we call it, was funded by the NIH to help coordinate the 65 supplement projects that were funded through the National Ending the HIV Epidemic initiative around implementation science methods. And so we offer a number of resources, including trainings, or we did offer in-person training, webinars such as this one, online resources, and coaching to those projects. A lot of the materials we have made or are making public as well, which you can access through the Implementation Science Working Group website on the Third Coast CFAR page. I will be posting that in the chat later on. It's also my job to do some housekeeping and then introduce our wonderful speakers. So just a few things. I've muted everyone's microphones and cameras on entry so that we don't have a lot of disturbances to the speakers. I want you to be aware that the webinar is being recorded, and we'll be able to share the slides and the recordings on that Implementation Science Working Group webpage later on. The speakers will turn on their cameras when I introduce them, but then in order to avoid distractions, they'll turn off their cameras during their talk and then turn them back on during the discussion portion at the end. We ask that people hold their questions till the end, but you can feel free to type in questions in the chat function in BlueJeans to your right-hand side of the screen. You can type them directly to the group chat, or if you would like to ask a question more anonymously, you can direct message me, and I will ask those at the end. Finally, I've also placed in the chat 2 links to kind of an online forum that will then translate to live results during the talk. So those should be accessible through the chat, and the speakers will also have those links on their slides. So without further ado, let me introduce our 2 speakers today. Juan, Jen, if you wouldn't mind turning on your camera.
Hello, everyone.
So Juan Villamar is the executive coordinator of CPIM, or the Center for Prevention Implementation Methodology at Northwestern University. He's a senior program administrator in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Feinberg School of Medicine. He has served as executive coordinator for the Center for Prevention Implementation Methodology, and in that capacity, he has led the CPIM faculty, with the CPIM faculty, the formation of partnerships for implementation research with the Substance Use and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, and with community-based organizations in Chicago. Jen Brown is the director and co-founder of ARC, or the Alliance for Research in Chicagoland Communities, at Northwestern University. Director and co-founder, I said that, in Northwestern University Center for Community Health. Jen is passionate about ARC's mission to grow equitable research partnerships between Chicago area communities and Northwestern University to improve health and health equity. Jen has over 20 years of experience building and supporting community academic engaged research partnerships at project, institutional, and multi-institutional levels. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers.
Great. Thank you very much, Dennis, and thank you for serving as our moderator today. And thank you all for joining us. We're excited to spend an hour with you this afternoon and hope that the information that we share with you today is thought-provoking and useful. So first, we want to acknowledge our community and academic partnerships that have informed our experience and the work that we will be presenting today. We, of course, also want to acknowledge our sponsors. Okay, this is our outline for today. And so that we can get going quickly and have the best use of our time, we want to turn over to our live poll. So if you can, I kindly ask that you write this bit.ly address directly into your web address. You can also copy paste it from the chat feature in BlueJeans and drop it into your web address without putting www or .com at the beginning and at the end of it, so just drop it directly in there. And we want to ask you two questions. We want to know who you represent and what your experience is in building partnerships. And I'll leave this slide up here for a little bit so that you can see the bit.ly address. And if you're having any issues accessing the poll, please shoot us a message via BlueJeans in the chat feature. So now I've switched over my screen here, and I will start refreshing. Okay, to see who's responding. 5 people. Good. Refreshing here, 6 responses. Go for a second here. I'll give it 1 more minute. All right, 1 more response. Shall we let it go until 1 minute or 30 seconds?
Good.
Okay.
A general sense.
Okay.
Thanks, expert, for joining the call. We'll need your help later.
To start us off, I want to spend just a couple of minutes on terminology. Implementation practice is the use of strategies, and by strategies I mean things like adapting an intervention that works in one setting to a different setting, incentives for delivering an intervention to address the lack of motivation, and engaging stakeholders through a partnership, which we'll be spending a lot more time on today. Implementation research evaluates the use of strategies. Implementation science is the study of methods to promote the integration of evidence into healthcare policy and practice. And for a full recap of this terminology and an introduction to implementation science, I encourage you to watch the presentation by J.D. Smith, which was given at the EHE Summit, which is one of the videos that's available through the community, the work group website. I think that Dennis is going to drop in BlueJeans. I also want to define the roles that communities and researchers may fulfill when forming a partnership for implementation research or a partnership for implementation practice. In implementation research, we see communities enhancing the scientific integrity through implementation practice knowledge and lived experience. They ensure that the impact of the evidence is of relevance to the intended community. The researcher ensures the scientific integrity and serves as the research arm of the community. They advance science through partnership. And in implementation practice, the community really is leading the sustainment, the replication, and the evaluation of strategies and interventions. The researcher, on the other hand, becomes knowledgeable of the practice setting and the needs of the community and continues to develop research tools that support implementation practice. Communities and researchers both have active roles in these partnerships. So a reason why we're here today is because of the EHE initiative and the funding that was made available to address high priority gaps in one or more of the EHE pillars. These partnerships will be formed between researchers and local jurisdictions, which are defined as community-based organizations, local, county, and state health departments. The expected deliverable of the partnerships is an implementation science research project. And the funding announcement went out to say that the EHE initiative will depend on trusted partnerships, which is a pretty bold statement to make. Now that we have that in place, I think we can, get to work on forming our partnerships, right? But I think we will be remiss if we don't acknowledge some of the tensions that were brought up during the EHE Summit here in Chicago, as well as others that Jen and I are aware of when forming partnerships. We know that there can be tensions between priorities, timelines, time, and money. The EHE will depend on trusted partnerships, but we don't really know what that means. And EHE partnerships may be new or existing, but carrying out the implementation research is likely new to everyone. If there are other tensions in forming and maintaining partnerships, EHE partnerships or partnerships in general that you all are aware of, we encourage you to share it with your partners, and if you like, you can also share it with us. Where do partnerships fit in theories, models, and frameworks? Partnerships play a central role in the theories, models, and frameworks that are being used in implementation science. Here are three well-known frameworks: EPIS, CIFAR, and REAIM. The components, domains, and settings of these frameworks benefit from the exchange of knowledge and experience between community and the researchers through a partnership. I've highlighted one component or domain in each as an example of where partnerships sit. For REAIM, I highlighted the entire framework because, the framework really states that if an intervention that has reach and efficacy is only successful if it can be adopted, implemented, and maintained within the community. Implementation strategies are the set of structural, organizational, and procedural processes that form the support structure for a program or practice. There's a growing list of strategies, and an attempt to categorize them resulted in 9 broad categories. Can you all guess which category has the most strategies within it? If you guess develop stakeholder interrelationships, please give yourself some chocolate or the treat of your choice. So partnership formation and development is an implementation strategy, and one that we argue is necessary for implementation research. I want to distinguish between formation, which is what happens at the start of a partnership, and development, which refers to the maintenance and sustainment over time. So now that we've done a little bit of recap and framing, we can spend a little bit of time on the how-to of building partnerships. The principles that we're going to share with you today originate in community-engaged research, community organizing. They've been used in prevention science and in public health. Trust and power are essential components to partnerships. The way that we're going to talk about these principles are cyclical, and they're also not exhaustive. So we encourage the creation of principles that reflect the nuance unique to each of the partnerships that will be formed. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jen.
Thanks, Juan. That was a really great setup. So just kind of setting the stage for the foundation of what we're going to talk about for the rest of this webinar, just wanted to talk a little bit about what we mean when we talk about taking an engaged approach to research. And this really is an approach. It's not a method. It can apply to any type of research, whether that's basic, clinical, population health. All that it is acknowledging that for research to have impact, the best impact, we say that it requires a bidirectional exchange of expertise. So acknowledging and honoring the type of expertise that fits in academia in terms of scientific and methodological expertise, and also valuing the expertise that only comes from community in terms of local, cultural, practice, or lived experience expertise. And really, we require those multiple types of expertise to ensure that the value of research helps us getting to improving health and equity. We also want to acknowledge that when we talk about using this engaged approach, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a second, it really happens on a broad spectrum, and it doesn't look the same in all types of research or all research projects. And sometimes it's a more minimum form of engagement, and sometimes it's really equal partnership in all aspects, including even being driven by community or other partners. And then on the right-hand right part of your screen, I just wanted to reference the principles of engagement. So Dennis mentioned earlier that the program I direct sits inside the Center for Community Health at Northwestern, and these are, you'll find many principles, but they include many of these same elements of when we talk about engagement, we're talking obviously about collaboration, respect, equity, transparency is a key component, as well as impact, ensuring that research gets, beyond research findings only to impact. And I just want to acknowledge one other thing, is that in talking about engaged research and community academic research partnerships, typically it can be a little bit odd to do that only from the academic standpoint. So Juan and I just want to acknowledge that we have no community partner as a part of the group that's presenting today. We know we do have them on the call, and that, as Juan said, shared earlier, this is informed by the experience, but that in the future we hope to be able to involve community partners directly in these conversations.
Right.
So when we talk about engaged research and using an engaged approach to research, these questions are how you can determine whether something is engaged or how engaged it was. So here it's really presented in a binary, but as I said, it's more along a spectrum. So these could really be, some sort of ombre in between the purples or something. But you can ask yourself, who makes the decisions and who has the power? So in using a non-engaged or more traditional approach to research, the question would be generated by projects would be generated and initiated by researchers. When using an engaged approach, those might be coming from community or public partners or other stakeholders, or be collaboratively generated or designed. Related to all of the decisions that you might make in a research project. What's the method? Is there going to be a control group? What is going to be the eligibility or ineligibility criteria? Each piece, is that decided solely by the researcher or research team, or is there a shared governance and ownership in those decisions? Same with resources. Of course, we know that money holds a lot of power. And then, of course, the end point about whether the benefit of that really stays within the academic arena in terms of, dissemination and what's counted within academia, or that's going beyond that to not only making sure something is implemented, but it's sustained beyond the research collaboration. And so another thing to keep in mind as we're talking about community engaged or using an engaged approach, what do we mean when we say community? And obviously, that's a really big question. We could spend 5 webinars alone talking about that. Who is the community? Who represents the community? And so when you're thinking about the type of project that you're focusing on, the type of implementation research you're doing, that's going to vary for you. So if we had all the time in the world, we would put this is this colorful part on the left-hand side called the stakeholder flower, and we would give you a blank stakeholder flower and really ask you to consider what is the impact you're trying to have, what is the population that you're trying to impact, specifically ask you to put them in the center and think about what are all of the types of, what is that population made up of, what are all the types of other stakeholders, whether that's in the clinical arena or payers or policymakers that have an impact on that. So whether that's, so key is the individuals with lived experience themselves, so, patients, community members, caregivers, but then also thinking about what are the organizations and the agencies that have an impact, what are the stakeholders who have power to make decisions or make change, based on the findings, thinking of all of those that might come in, and also centering with an equity lens. When you think about the individuals with lived experience, when you think of the stakeholders, what are the ways that those most experiencing inequities are engaged and centered in this work? And then finally, often when we talk about community academic partnerships, we use a frame that's almost a false binary, as if there's a single academic and a single community, and typically you're going to engage many types of stakeholders at different times of your project for different purposes, which you'll see a little bit in this slide. So this is from our colleagues at Vanderbilt Meharry, led by Consuelo Wilkins. And it's a busy slide. I wanted to include it so that you can come back to this later and really look at it more deeply. But it starts to give you a sense of when we talk about community, when we talk about stakeholders, who is that and what are the mechanisms by which they may be involved in your group? And when I say that that you might have different types of engagement at different times. So on the vertical axis, you see extent of engagement. On the horizontal axis, you see number of stakeholders. The top of the slide is talking about kind of more ongoing forms of involvement, and the bottom of the slide is talking about more short-term involvement. So you may start wanting to get a broader understanding of what the work that you're going to do and have that be informed by a broader group. And that might use some of these mechanisms like listening sessions or focus groups or surveys where you really get to hear from a lot of people. But as you're moving into the conduct of a project or ongoing design and issues that might come up, then it might be important to have a smaller group of people that you can be collaborating with over time and bringing things back to. And that might be some of the models on the top, like an ongoing advisory group or steering committee or folks that are a part of your research team. So when you're thinking about the different types of stakeholders, again, they may play different roles. You might have community leads that are, or you might be community leads that are at a health department or at another type of public agency. And then you may be thinking about how are we engaging other type of stakeholders like clinicians or people living with HIV or other community members that you want to get involved in a different way. So again, different structures for different types of stakeholders might be appropriate.
Part of the reason why, describing these principles is to be able to, because we've identified that partnership formation and development is an implementation strategy. We want to give you all a way to be able to document, a way to be able to form and to document your partnership. So that's what these principles now that we're going to get into are how they're intended to help. Our first principle here is to identify who is required for support. And in the case of the EHE initiative, we know that the partnerships are to be formed between communities and researchers. So if you're a researcher, you want to identify who your community partner is going to be. And you do that by doing your homework. You exhaust your network and your network's network. Once you've identified the community, you want to learn the history, the vision, and the mission of that community. If there are open meetings that you can attend that are happening within the community, you should make time to attend so that you can learn about that community. Our goal of this principle is to understand and draw out power and power structures, what Shep Kellum referred to as drawing a political map. Understanding power means knowing where the funds that flow into the community come from, who has authority to terminate jobs, and how is performance measured, and why do people lose their jobs. This process of identification also entails a reflection that is happening as a community partner is identified.
So related to this, going a little bit deeper, part of the preparation that Juan just discussed is also to reflect on your own identity as a researcher, your own identity as community or a public agency that you might be representing, as well as the community or population that your work is serving. So, because that can really impact how you approach this work. Another part of this understanding is thinking about how your communities or stakeholders will consider partnering. What have been their past experiences with this research, and what might be the benefits or challenges of partnering in research? Part of this might be acknowledging the way they feel about research, past or current negative research partnerships that they might be a part of. So it's best not to assume that everyone is on the same page, that research is great, research is going to make life better. But really being transparent about the negatives and discussing how using a collaborative approach might be part of designing a research project and research impact that will be more mutually beneficial to everyone, because that might not have been their experience in the past. But being able to talk through and spending some time thinking through how will partnering improve or challenge, our organization, our services, lives of our clients, on the community side. And as a stakeholder, it's also important to kind of think through what's our research status quo? How do we currently value or use research within our organization or agency so that we're best set up to benefit from findings that would or the process of participating in this research partnership? I think another part of that elephant that Juan talked about earlier is also we're trying to build equitable partnerships in a funding and academic structure that is not really designed for that. So if a grant goes to the academic partner and the community or public partner is a subcontract, that's not really equitable from the beginning. So best to be transparent about that and talked about how to address it if that's important. So these are just different things that might contribute how, the foundation of setting up these trusting relationships from the beginning.
The second principle in this implementation strategy that we're describing around partnership building has to do with engage and building trust. For researchers, this means traveling to the offices of the community partner with the intention to learn about their priorities. And learning here is done through active listening, which we define as listening for and reflecting back. Researchers should also consider engaging at all levels of the community for the reasons that Jen was talking about earlier. From the leadership with power to the stakeholders with the lived experiences who may be affected by the inequities perpetuated within the community. The researchers can also reflect on what they are learning about the community and notice how that informs their research ideas and the research that they would like to conduct. Because we are focusing on building trust, we prefer to leave some topics for a later conversation, like discussing your research idea, selecting interventions, having conversations about data and measurement. Since the focus is on engagement and building trust, we can leave those for later.
And for community stakeholders, some of the things during this period of time of engaging and building trust, which starts at the beginning, but of course never ends. Community stakeholders might be thinking about what are the things you really want your research partner to know about your community or the population that you represent. As Juan said earlier, we hope that researchers will do their stakeholders before they engage, but there also might be some additional things that they won't have known or stories or politics, whatever that community stakeholders want them to know. And what are the things that you want research partners to share with you? I've often heard from community partners that they want to get a sense of the passion that researchers bring to their work and why this is something they chose to do and why they're engaging, not just because it's a required component or that it's a strategy within implementation science, but like what do they see as the benefits for it? And then of course, for the community stakeholder to be thinking through for themselves, what are the benefits that you as an organization or an agency or your community is seeking as a part of this partnership so that you can ask for those up front. And then there's some also, more practical things, during this phase that both community partners and stakeholders and researchers want to be thinking about. You're almost, dating or interviewing each other, just because you look good on paper, like you represent the community that we want to engage and you've got the expertise, doesn't mean that you will be compatible. So thinking about what that looks like, do you always communicate by text or email? Like little things can make a big difference. Also thinking about that, who else needs to be at the table? Again, we mentioned that partnerships aren't binary, and at different phases, you're going to want to make sure that you are reflecting input from a broad group or engaging them. So at the end of the project, it's not, this is a project of someone else, they're asking me to do something, but, oh, I was a part of this, I was contributing it. And then thinking through, there's going to be some, whether this is within individual research teams or agencies, who makes some decisions about whether to engage in a partnership, to support a partnership, what that looks like, who gives input into the decision, who makes that final decision, and then who is notified about that decision. You want to think up and down the structure or hierarchy of your different partner organizations that are involved.
In our third principle, we ask both communities and researchers to identify and write out their mutual self-interests. And here we define mutual self-interest as the overlapping priorities, those individual and shared agendas that can exist at the organizational level. A process to help accomplish this is something called co-creation, which is the development of a shared body of usable knowledge across scientific, governance, and local practice boundaries. So in writing your mutual self-interest, you will address some of the following things. What are the roles and responsibilities of partnership members? How will communication happen? And will there be rules of engagement? How are decisions made? How will findings be disseminated? How are conflicts addressed and resolved? This principle also covers partnership oversight. So
these are some of the things that you might want to think about is, how you will be checking back in about whether these things are happening and how that you'll be holding each other and others accountable. And this slide lists some of the other things too. I think one thing that, you can take a lot of guidance from, looking at models of past partnerships you've been involved in, what other partnership been doing. We have template, memorandum of understanding, that kind of thing. But I think what's important to consider during this phase is that actually having the conversation among the stakeholders, that's the most important part, almost more than the document that comes out of it or even the decision, but the process of having that conversation. So discussing and agreeing on how you want to work together, that's really the key piece.
Our fourth principle is quite simple, I think. But it entails a challenging topic, which is to anticipate and prepare for crises. A crisis is a threat to the partnership stability, and typically it will question trust. This principle calls for addressing the crisis head-on and immediately by moving towards each other. We also encourage folks to document what happened and prepare a plan to prevent those crises to happen in the future. In our experience, when these crises are overcome, trust is strengthened among partnership members.
And there's no shortage of possible crises. Yeah. Don't mean for this slide to be overwhelming, but I think we all know that there are a lot of things that can go wrong. And we actually tell partnerships, or partnerships have told us that some of the best way to prevent crises are to discuss them before they happen. So, it could, start almost in a lighthearted way, like as you're getting going, while you're doing that engaging and building trust phase, take a moment to brainstorm, what are all the possible things that could go wrong? Our PI could move to a new institution. Our research project manager could leave. Our budget could be cut by 50%. A racist, a homophobic incident could take place. Think of all the things that could go wrong and talk about them before everyone's hot under the collar in the case. Now, you can't always make a plan because it's not going to be the same plan for each of those types of crises that I mentioned. But again, the process of having those conversations and seeing how people respond, even sometimes in a fun role play type of way, can be really instructive into building a stronger relationship that allows your partnership the ability to handle those things when they do come up.
And with that, we get to our fifth and final principle, and we're going to switch roles here, and Jen is going to start talking about this one first.
Okay, and so this is really, as we said from the beginning, partnership development, partnership maintenance and sustaining. This is something that is cyclical, iterative. It'll keep going on, and it never ends. And so, but you do want to take measure of how it's going, and not make assumptions about it. So, you start out as potential partners. You move to partners, and then when do you become a partnership? When do you become a collaborative, a group that's working together? Through partially doing this and continuing to show up, to put in the work, to develop a partnership that includes humor, and allowing space and time for this. And another big part of this is celebrating. We just talked about all the things that could go wrong, but you want to keep fun in this and recognize all the benefits that come out of having these new relationships and doing this right. We don't always remember to do that, so creating that space and time, whether you kind of do a every 6-month check-in survey or once a year, or one of our partnerships this year suggested to us on Valentine's Day or a separate day, we shouldn't just check in with our personal loved ones, but it's also a chance to check in with our work loved ones. How's our relationship going? Can we celebrate? Can we talk about how we can make this stronger?
And a theory that can help explain and detect a change and measure it when you're moving from partners to partnerships is cultural exchange theory. In stage 3 of this theory is the emergence of a new culture. So as you're moving from communication to collaboration to compromise, a partnership with its own language and developmental history forms. It also will have measurable milestones, and it will continue to work on and identify those mutual self-interests that are being worked on by the partnership members. So we actually did pretty good with time because this is our summary slide. So to recap, the foundations of partnerships for implementation research and practice comes from community engaged research and community organizing. They increase the value of research for improving health and equity in communities. Partnerships are necessary to conduct implementation research. Partnerships exist on a continuum, and the processes for partnership formation and maintenance are cyclical. And right at the end, we presented a way to measure partnership development, moving from partners to partnership and detecting the formation of a new culture. So partnerships for implementation research and practice support community priorities like selecting and delivering the best available interventions to community members and improving health outcomes. Partnerships inform and guide the research questions, ensuring that the impact of research is of value to the community that will benefit from it. With that, we've gotten to the end of our content, and we have some time to hear your reactions, hopefully answer your questions if you have them, and get into our discussion. I've also included here another bit.ly link to a form that you can complete if you do not want to share your reactions or your questions right now. We've included in this form some open-ended questions that will help you reflect if you are an EHE funded grantee. And if you're not an EHE funded grantee, then they'll help you reflect on the types of partnerships that you are forming between, if you're, with others.
Hi, everyone. So I put the link in the chat as well. If you're able to click on that, that should take you to the form directly. It's just a way for to guide the conversation moving forward. But since there's kind of a smaller group of us, you can also feel free to post questions directly into the chat to me or to the whole group. Or if you are, once we kind of start to look at people's, if the people who are filling out the form, if we have additional questions, we can also unmute you and have a conversation.
Yeah, I know we had one. Okay, you do have one? Okay, go ahead.
So our first question is, it looks like it kind of got caught up, but like, what does EHE stand for?
Oh, it would have been good to define that, right? So EHE is the End the HIV Epidemic Initiative, and it is an initiative that is gathering, first it appropriated funds from Congress to federal agencies with the goal of reducing HIV infection and spread. Then hopefully I said that correctly, and if someone that knows more about EHE can correct me on that. But that is as I understand what EHE is. But it's a very good question. I shouldn't have assumed that folks knew what that was. Sorry about that.
We have another question from Christina Rodriguez-Hart. What do you do if you're working with a researcher who believes they're good at community engagement and it seems evident that they are not? Ooh, a good question.
What do you do with a researcher who believes that they're good at community engaged research, but there's evidence to say that they are not?
Oh, and people are not pulling any punches starting out. Right, okay. Yeah, that's hard. I mean, because we would like to say, like, all research should be engaged. Like, there's a mechanism of engagement that's appropriate for all research. But I will admit, not all researchers are the best at engagement. Not all community partners are the best at engagement, too. Again, I think also we hope that partnerships are typically fuller partnerships, so not just the binary of a single person on each side. But I think, and that's also part of the trust building space, is the building enough trust where people feel safe to be vulnerable and share when things aren't going well. And if there's a way, you might be building the space to do that directly. You may be doing that, building the space to do that through, a collaborative, like having, if someone's doesn't feel safe to say that directly to a person, but be able to potentially say that to a colleague or someone else that can help address the situation. And sometimes, and that's what I mean at the beginning when I said that during the engagement and trust building phase, you're kind of dating, you're trying to figure out if this is going to be a good relationship. Not all relationships, even when there's a match, are a good match. And so thinking about, when is this the right person or partnership to engage in? I hesitate to bring this too much, like to compare it to a relationship, a personal relationship, but it can be like that.
Yeah, and I guess the only other comment that I would add to that is there was a special issue that came out I think last year on community engaged dissemination and implementation research, which was the attempt by the field, the current scientists, to talk about what it means to have community engagement in D&I research. And one of the articles presented a measure that was intended to help prepare researchers for engagement. So it had asked the researchers some really pointed questions about not, whether, because the framing sometimes is whether a community is ready to engage with research, but this measure was about, it was for, the questions were for the researcher to assess their readiness to engage in community dissemination and implementation research. And I'm happy to share that article with folks if that's a means of communicating, someone's readiness to engage with communities.
Dennis, you look like you said something, but we can't hear you.
Sorry, we did have a comment that said, yes, please share that article.
Okay, great.
We have another question, and I might ask Juan and Jen if you wouldn't mind turning on your camera.
Yeah.
So that folks can see your lovely faces. Some of the EHE projects, or the Ending the HIV projects, represent one researcher working with multiple community organizations. Any suggestions for how to identify strengths and needs of each organization and moving forward a collaboration with multiple partners?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that in the same way that we said that typically partnerships aren't binary and there's a strength to that, there's also that there's complexity that come with that too. And I think as a part of that process of building that relationship and talking about, as Juan did earlier, what are the roles and responsibilities, that might be, at some points, that might be very practical about, to do this work together, we have, these protocols or these things, these activities that will need to get done. But I think combining that with a combination of like, who is the right partner to do that, and also remembering as a part of that, like to center, community, how are we ensuring that the way we've, collaboratively determined which partner will take what role, hopefully we'll be centering the leadership of those most impacted community partners and people with lived experience. But being able to have that, we do a lot of, people have different reactions to like more kumbaya, like getting to know each other activities, icebreakers, but I wouldn't underestimate the power of some of that alongside this work. And there are certainly a number of, icebreakers or strength finders or those kind of things that can be built into, the more practical agenda items that you have to get done too. Juan?
Yeah. I think that the question to me also, it raises a question for me about how much time you have to build your partnership and to identify who needs to be sitting at the table. So if time isn't an issue, then you can really spend a lot of time exploring And even within the bounds of a research grant, you can continue to explore how the partnership can be strengthened by asking that question of the members that are around the table. I think so long, so long as there's an agreement at the table of who is represented and that folks that are at the table can carry out that work, then you have a strong partnership. I mean, if what you're proposing you can carry out with the folks you're at the table, then I think you can continue to question who else can be here, but you also need to learn about, how you can carry out that role for the partnership members. So.
Yeah, one other thing I would just add is that, again, it won't necessarily be static. One, that might change. Like, we might think a strength lies in a certain place, and then we might be doing the work, and you might find an issue coming up, and we may need to rejigger that. So being willing to have that conversation once, and if it's not working, allowing space to have that conversation
right.
again. And I think that's also related to, as you start to get into who does what and where do the strengths lie, that may raise the question again about who's not at the table that should be.
Right.
And sometimes that's as simple as like, oh, we realize we really need this type of infographic or graphic design. We don't have that here. And sometimes it's, more about, we realize, oh, our table looks really white, but the population we serve doesn't. So, thinking about that in a nuanced way about representation, both of strength, skill, identity.
Right.
We have one question in the form, but before I ask that one, I know we do have perhaps some people who are on a phone, so who may not have access to like typing into the chat. So if anyone who's using a phone to connect wants to ask a question, I believe you hit *4 to unmute your phone. I want to give you a chance to ask questions as well. Or anyone who's not on a phone, you can unmute yourself as well. Okay, so the question that we got in the forum was, how is program evaluation different from implementation partnerships? Evaluating how they implement our protocol is often viewed as a judgment.
Yeah. So it sounds like two questions. Is that one question or two questions? Sorry.
That is one question. So how is program evaluation different for implementation partnerships? With a kind of a qualifier, like sometimes if you're evaluating a program, it can be viewed by the community partners like judging how they implemented your protocol.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, one thing that I can say about that is it's important, it would be important to acknowledge what the evaluation is for and what language is used so that it's not perceived as a judgment on how well you are doing something. If you are evaluating how an intervention is being delivered by, folks that are directly delivering services to people that live in communities. And I think in implementation science, evaluation is seen as a feedback loop that helps assess how well something is being delivered. So it's a delicate balance to try and strike. If we are, the language we have to be very careful with that, I think. That's my initial reaction to it, my initial thoughts to it.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is, one is that's a great question, and it's definitely something that comes up. And it's certainly, I think when the word crisis in the presentation was strong, but like that's a challenge that could come up that, again, you might want to talk about before you enter in the work. Like, okay, this is framed as an evaluation. How do we feel about that? What if we find out something that we didn't want to find out? or, it seems like we're finding out something about, that could sound negative. How do we want to handle a situation like that? And I think this also speaks to what level, what type of different partners or level of different partners have kind of bought into this partnership. Is it leadership? Is it frontline workers? Is it service providers? Is it clients? Because all of those people will be involved in the project and maybe having perceptions or, feelings about what that means. And so if it's leadership that is signed on to do this project and they have an understanding of why we want to do this evaluation, and then it's not a judgment, but that other people that are more service providers or frontline workers don't share that, then that is going to come to pass when the results come out. So kind of thinking about how people are all on board, or getting people on board, how they all have an opportunity to contribute. So again, it doesn't feel like something that's passively being done to them, but their input about what they want to learn about how the program operates or their experience as a provider of the program. So these are aspects that can help to build their engagement in the process too. So again, it's not something being done to them, but it's their thing. They are, a part of the decision maker or the governance of it.
And we have time for one more question from Marla. What are ways to support sustained partnerships and programs, especially financially?
Well, I think that's important. We actually talked about this a little bit when we were planning this. Is this talking from the beginning about, is this a partnership that's being formed solely for the purpose of an individual implementation research project? Is this a partnership that's going to kind of go over more of an arc of work that takes place over multiple projects? Is this a project that's going to continue into, sustainability of an intervention, post the research phase of it, so that expectations are clear from the beginning and it doesn't feel like, hey, why are they ghosting? Why did they break up? I thought we were in this together, by having an understanding of that from the beginning. And I'll say, and maybe there's this discussion of yes, we're going to be, this is a long-term relationship, we're going to have long-term partners. It can be, talking about, so what does that mean if we have a gap in research funding that's really supporting our ability to come together and do the things that support the engagement structure, whether that's regular meetings or, a little bit of time for people, what does that look like? And what do we do, kind of talking about this before it happens, what are we going to do during a gap in funding? Are we going to keep meeting whether we're supported or not? Are we going to not meet, but, trust in that the partnership is still strong and we'll reconvene when we're able to in a next grant? So there's a shared understanding. And again, people don't feel like, hey, they just, it fell apart at that time. So having some shared expectations, thinking about, if sustaining this kind of relationship or collaboration is really key in between research grants or post-research grants, what are the types of funding or what are the other types of support that may allow that to happen?
Yeah, I think those are really great points. I think what I would add to that is so implementation science is defining itself as a field, and federal agencies are really standing behind it. I don't think there's any going back now from, the theories, models, and frameworks and defining what the science is supposed to do. And it really, you have to work within the context. If you're a researcher, you have to work within the context of your community. You have to work within the service setting that you are intending to have an impact in. So I think we are likely to see more funding be made available to sustain partnerships. I'm going to throw my bet in that direction. I don't know if it's going to happen, but I would be really disappointed to see this much interest by researchers and by federal agencies and service agencies to ask folks to engage with each other and not provide the time and the dollars to actually, form the partnerships that are needed to sustain programs and policies within community settings. So maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, but that's something I'm I'm kind of hoping for.
And I guess the other thing I would just add would be that if a partnership is going to end, it's not always this negative thing like it's a failure and that's why this partnership ends. Sometimes that's what makes sense. And that's another thing just to talk about to make sure that there's a mutual shared understanding of that is we're not doing this because the partnership didn't work, but with intentionality, that at this point, there's a mutual agreement that it's appropriate and relevant for this partnership to end, and we're going to do it in these mindful ways. The fact, like understanding that relationships have been formed and work has been done and making sure that that's, wrapped up in a way that's good for everybody.
Yep.
So we are at the top of the hour. I want to take a moment to thank our wonderful speakers and for their insights and for this great presentation. I do have one comment I want to read. Partnerships may end on discrete projects, but relationships should not end, which is a wonderful comment to end on.
Right.
I know everyone is muted, but please join me in thanking our Jen and Juan for the information that they've shared and for spending their time with us. Their contact information is up online, so feel free to email and reach out to any of us. I also posted in the chat, feel free to email iski@northwestern.edu if you want copies of this, or to be notified when the slides and the recording are made available. Thank you both, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you, everyone.